record of the full authority meeting shall consist solely of the minutes approved by the full authority. Welcome, everybody. Any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. We have no hearing board today. Next on the agenda is minutes of the meeting for January 23rd. Any errors or omissions? See no errors or omissions. Mover and seconder. Ralph moves. Joe seconds. All in favor? Carried. Next, matters arising, watershed conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick update. Water levels throughout the watershed have been slightly higher than normal. That's due to a lot of the rain that we've received in the last few weeks. We did update our watershed condition statement flood outlook for the shoreline on February 4th. That's just a reminder, ongoing reminder for villagers in Port Stanley to be aware of water conditions at all times. We did break another record. Lake Erie is now broken water level record again for January and February. We are now at 174.91 meters. Chart datum is 173.5, and we're 9 centimeters higher than the record right now.
Thank you, Jennifer. Any questions for Jennifer in the report? Seeing none, thanks, Jennifer.
To receive, yeah.
Receive,
Please.
move on to the report. Second, Steve. All in favor? Carried. Next, correspondence. First, from Conservation Ontario to Honorable John Dekabuski. Any comments from you?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, all the correspondence that was put out in the advance package are just for the information of members. Just a reminder of the annual meeting road trip that's coming up over the next couple of weeks. So Catfish Creek Conservation Authority is happening February 20th. So is Lower Thames. That was previously communicated out to you. And then on February 28th, there's an invitation to Long Point Regions Conservation Authority. I know I'm going to try to make as many as I can, and if board members either through their council representation or here at the board can make those meetings, I encourage you to.
Comments? Motion to receive and file. Preston and Jaguar. All in favor? Carried. Okay, next we move down to the audited draft financial statements, and I'd like to welcome Scott Travers and Jim Frederick to the table, and welcome guys, and Scott will probably lead us through it.
I'll be leading this through, guys. We ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Good to see you. I'm Scott Travers. I'm Graham Scott Enns, the senior manager there. Because we're senior in front of it, so been doing it a while now. And Jim Frederick's partner there. So we'll just kind of go over kind of the financial statements at a high level here. Okay, so you guys have all seen these. No, do they go up there? Or no?
I didn't put them up,
Okay.
all up on the screen.
Okay. The first chunk is our auditor's report, independent auditor's report. Okay, so this is kind of our responsibility here. Which kind of outlines kind of who's responsible for what. I think kind of at the top we have our opinion about the financial statements. Okay, we've audited. I'll read it. We've audited the financial statements of Kettle Creek Conservation Authority, which comprises a statement of financial positions as at December 31st, 2019. Statement of operations and accumulated surplus. Statement of change in net financial assets. Statement of cash flows for the year that ends with the financial statements, including a summary of significant accounting policies. That's necessary. Financial statements, and in our opinion, the organization's financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the organization as at December 31st, 2018, and the results of its operations and its cash flows for the year ended in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. Okay, so that's to say that we use the word material quite a bit, that just if there was a mistake, we don't deem it to be significant enough to sway the user's opinion on these statements. Okay? The next few paragraphs in here, so you can outline who's responsible for what. So responsibilities for management, so these are management's financial statements, not ours. They gave us the numbers, they provided the notes, the financial statements, we just kind of audited and conformed conformance with our standards. So the last paragraph, you see outlines kind of our responsibilities, then on to page 2 as well, kind of gives you 4 or 5 tabs that kind of explain high level what an audit is. And then the last paragraph is we will communicate those charged with governance, which is you folks at this table, regarding among other matters, the plan scope, the timing of the audit, any findings that we have, anything we consider significant that we need to communicate, material control deficiencies or anything else that we found during our audit. So we'll have a letter at the end of this that'll kind of outline that. That's kind of our it's kind of our due diligence to communicate that to you folks, whether there is anything or not. Okay?
Just on that page to the report date, it says report date right now, as opposed to an actual date. We anticipate that date being February 19th, which is the date of your annual meeting, where these, I presume the financial statements will be approved.
Which is consistent with every other year.
Yes.
Right? So that'll be next week, February 19th. Okay, so that's our auditor's report. The rubber stamp on what's behind here. Okay,
So that's it, we're done.
we're done. Let's try to quickly go over the pages that are attached to here. That's great. The next page, page 3, is our statement of financial positions, or balance sheet, assets and liabilities, what we own, what we owe. It's broken into a couple of different sections. The top chunk's financial assets, right? So cash, and then that can be converted to cash, receivables. 1.2 million, up a little bit from the year before as well. 1.2 million as well, maybe $50,000 swing. So we have our cash or short-term investments and any receivables that we, for services or our government remittances that we provided in the year that have not received yet. Okay. Financial liabilities, so our payables at the end of the year, so things like wages, OMERS, any ongoing projects. That's our accounts payable through liabilities. And then our deferred revenue and the liabilities of $410,000, which is capital grants, deposits on campgrounds, and any other sort of deferrals and stewardship funding, things like that we haven't spent yet. You'll see they all have little notes attached to them. We won't go over those now. Just kind of flip through them when we get to them. Okay. So net financial assets, which is assets, financial assets, less your liabilities, $771,000, compared to $755,000 the year before. Okay. Then we get our non-financial assets, so tangible things. Prepaids and inventories, and then our tangible capital assets, so our roads, our dams, our vehicles, our equipment, anything like that. So $3 million compared to 2.9 the year before. We added some additions, then we systematically amortize those assets over their estimated useful lives. So those are at cost, not in sort of, if there wasn't any fair value attached to them, that would, they're not stated at that, it's at cost. Okay, so total community surplus, $3,789,000 compared to $3,751,000 the year before. So the change in that numbers are, yes, our profit for the year, $38,000. Okay. Next page is our statement of operations and accumulated surplus. So our income statement for the year. Just to mention, the balance sheet was a point in time, December 31st. This is for 12 months with a comparative and a budget. Maybe you guys have seen these numbers throughout the year, so just kind of skip it down to that surplus of $38,000. So we didn't change anything. There was no adjustments, no findings that we had to change during our audit testing. So that $38,000, I guess it was unchanged from what was provided, and then that would be allocated to our different surpluses and reserves. Okay, so $38,000 down from $155,000 the year before. Okay. Anyone wants to get any other details on that? Any questions on that? None? Moving forward. Page 5 is the statement of changes in net financial assets. This kind of takes our income, $38,000, kind of pulls out items that are not financial assets, something to do with our TCA, to kind of show how we changed our net financial assets by $16,000. Okay. Next page is a statement of cash flows, so inflows and outflows over the course of the year. So we break it out into chunks as well. Cash flows from operating, capital, and financing. So our cash flows from operating about halfway down are $223,000 compared to $226,000 the year before. And then we invest that in things like capital assets, our investments. So we purchased $146,000 in capital assets compared to $219,000 the year before. We received no capital funding in the year. That was specifically allocated to capital assets. Gives us a net change in cash at $76,000, which puts our cash equivalents up to $1.1 million. Okay. what we have is our operating cash and then a high interest bank account, is that short-term investments. Okay? And the next page is our notes to the financial statements. So the first few pages are our, kind of a summary of significant accounting policies and how we report our transactions within the authority. Things like we use estimates in the financial statements on what they are, how do we recognize our revenues, what some of our reserves are, what they're used for. TCA, or tangible capital assets, how we amortize those. Kind of how we record our government transfers, what are our cash and cash equivalents, things to that extent. Okay?
So just on that note, note 1.
Yep.
There was no changes to any of
There's
those?
no updates or changes in the
Policies?
accounting standards this year, nothing that's,
That would be something that would show up on a letter if it
that would
happened.
be significant. Yep. Okay? Occasion there is changes. Note page 10, note 2, we outline where our funding comes from the municipalities. Note 3, a little brief on our short-term investments, high interest bank account and the interest that we earn on it. Note 4 is our credit facility, it shows we have overdraft if we ever required it, and we didn't use it. Pension plans, which requires disclosure, disclose how much we contribute to owners. Note 6 is our next page, is our budgeted figures, which takes us to kind of our PSAT budget, so in things like reserve transfers, which might be built into your budgets, are not actually revenues and expenditures under our accounting framework. Okay. Note 7, donated services, which just explains that we do the higher donated services, we just don't recognize them in the statements because there's no way to give a dollar figure on those. Deferred revenues, there they are with the 3 different buckets that we have, stewardship projects, so the money we received that we haven't flowed out yet, campground deposits, and our capital funding. Okay. Page 12, note 9 is accumulated surplus and reserves, so where we put a surplus every year kind of flows into our reserve, so we use that surplus of $38,000, we either put it in a reserve or we use it to kind of fund our amortization of our capital assets. Okay, you can see the different reserves that we've built up over the years, from $907,000 compared to $912,084. Okay. Note 10 is a little supplemental information. So on the statement of operations, we have broken out by segment. This kind of has it by object, so you can see the total that we spent on salaries, materials, amortization, anything that relates to vehicle. Okay. Note 11 is our related party, or I think environmental trust that we have. We need to disclose kind of the funding that we receive from them. And the next 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 are schedules of all the different segments that we have in a little more further detail, what we're spending on in those different segments. Okay? I'll give you the detail on those. Those will be, you'd see those on at least a quarterly basis, I think. In page 19 and 20 are kind of our outline our schedule TCA. You can see this year we have $146,000 in the different buckets that we have, brand, building, dams, excuse me, so on and so forth, and kind of related amortization that we charge to each of those buckets of assets. Okay, and there's page 19 and 20, we outline those. Okay,
Page 19 is 2019 and page 20 is 2018
correct.
for comparative purposes.
Okay, that's all I have in your financial statements. It's a brief item there. Auditor's report, is what we're responsible for. Whoever's in.
Any questions for the gentleman?
In terms of the audit findings, I'm gonna jump in. Letter, there's not much here to report, obviously, it's a standardized letter. It just notes any significant matters arising during the audit, which there weren't any. There were no, I mentioned there were no changes in the significant accounting policy, the summary, the accounting policies in note 1 to the financial statements. There's no particular accounting estimates that we're concerned about. There's no, we didn't identify any basically deficiencies in the financial statement disclosure. Our uncorrected misstatements, so-called, are below the materiality level, so there's no issues with that. We did not identify any particular significant deficiencies in internal control that we would want to report to you. Certainly, we do study the internal controls, and there are discussions with management about those controls. And then separately, we requested written representation from management of the basically representing to us that the records are in fact the records of the organization. And that's about it, other than thanking everybody for their assistance in performing the audit, and basically that's it. So that's dated February 19th for the audit date, so I'm presuming, who needs to sign that?
Usually the chair.
The chair of the board, right? So I don't know if you want to hold that and give it back to us on the 19th, or what you want to do.
So, staff.
Mr. Chair, usually we put the audited finding letter in the advance package. If you could approve the audit finding letter at this time, then the chair would go ahead and execute that following the AGM. In terms of the acceptance of the actual audit, that will happen next week at the AGM. So today, the only thing that I'm asking you to consider is that the finding letters be approved. And then you'll approve the financial statements next, or the audited financial statements next week.
Any further comments from staff side?
No, I just, again, it's another clean audit for Kathleen, which is evidence of her dedication and attention to detail throughout the year. So I applaud her and all the staff for that. And just welcome any questions from members.
Any questions? Seeing none, I have a motion to accept the audited financial letter of
Audit finding.
Audit finding.
Ralph, move, seconds, Tommy, all in favor? Carried. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Usually these.
Sure.
We'll see you next week.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
The chair, certainly.
So, moving down to new business, our first report is Dale Dam Hazard Potential Classification Report. And I'd like to welcome Pat Dominic. Hope I got that right. Welcome, Pat. Our hydro-technical engineer that's done the report. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you everyone, welcome. So I will present to you some of the findings of this hydrotechnical study that our firm has undertaken with the Dalewood Dam and with the KCCA. So I will talk about some of the project history that has, how we came to this point and what we have done, some of the results, and some of the next steps that were presented in that report. I believe you were given a copy of the report in the package, so if you had questions later, we can go through those. Okay, so how do I advance? It's not, oh, I guess it's this way. Okay. So this is just an image on one of the, I pulled some of these images from the Kettle Creek's website on some of the flooding around the dam. They were drawn images. But to start this presentation, to give you a bit of a background, how did we all start here? So during the construction of the reconstruction of the Dalewood Dam Bridge, I was working for a company that at the time had a little contract to look after the riprap placement on one of the embankments, and then I kind of stood there, and Jen and Elizabeth were there, and we were kind of talking, and I said, well, have you ever had a safety assessment done of this dam? And okay, well, we had inspections and this and that, and then so in the end it ended up being that this dam, given its age, it really needed like a safety characterization, and that's and then eventually over the last year, Elizabeth has worked to put together this and to put together the scope on which we bid, and eventually ended up doing the work. Right. So some of the other things that I will talk about here are the basic description of the dam, some of the scope that we have done, findings, and the next steps. So basic description here, the dam is about 100 years old. It's about a 6 meter high, so about 20 feet. It's a 25 meter long concrete spillway that spans Kettle Creek with 100 meter long embankments. That's about 50 on one side, 50 on the other side as we're looking down towards St. Thomas here. The control structure, so this is the center of the dam, has an existing stop log lifter. That's what you see in the image below here. And the stop log lifter is presently not operational. There's some issues with that as well. We'll talk about that later. The dam impounds a reservoir upstream. Everybody knows that. The reservoir is heavily silted or heavily filled with sediment, and it's currently at equilibrium, meaning that the amount of sediment that gets deposited is the same amount that gets flushed, so the sediment is not increasing or decreasing. Now that was not part of our scope, that's a general finding here, as well as the downstream area of this dam is the entire, I guess it would be the western portion of St. Thomas. So the objective here of this study was, in any kind of a safety assessment, we have to know what the design conditions would be at this dam. We don't know the design conditions at the dam unless we know what it's classified as, whether it's low, high, very high. And we don't know the classification unless we know what happens when a dam breaks and how many people get flooded downstream. So essentially this was the study that would look into classify the dam according to provincial rules on classification. So as part of this work, we were tasked to carry out various types, so that to survey the reservoir, to survey the bridges and the river downstream, so about 10 kilometers of river, to carry out the hydraulic modeling, so this is to estimate the water levels and flows in the river downstream of the dam, to carry out the dam break analyses, and I'll talk a bit about that, to also carry out a preliminary slope stability analysis and look at the state of the berms at the sides of the dam, as well as to carry out a public safety assessment and identify concerns if public comes close to the dam, whether there can be some safety issues. And we have identified a few, which I will share with you. I apologize, I didn't have time to do this. Pencil and paper is sometimes best, but you have to bear through my sketch. So what you see here is just a basic sketch of the dam and how we classify a dam. So just to give you some of that technical detail, we have the berms, so we have to assume we have to break this dam, but we break it in a computer and then simulate its consequence downstream and essentially evaluate, well, if this dam breaks, is the extra water that rushes from this dam enough to cause any incremental harm? Now, there is regular flooding that happens whether the dam is present or not. Now, specifically, this analysis looks at whether the failure of the dam contributes and increases the hazard due to flooding as a result of the breaking. So it's a very specific type analysis that looks at that increment, right? So if you can imagine, if someone is already flooded by, let's say, I don't know, this much, let's say a foot of water, and then the dam comes in and breaks and they get flooded by that much, that's a huge deal. And that would be identified as a safety risk. Now, luckily for those in St. Thomas, that wasn't the case here. But anyhow, so that's kind of what we did. We essentially just put a hole in the dam. And of course, the geotechnical input had to go in to determine the size and the width of the hole. And then we've estimated the impacts downstream. So some of the factors that go into provincial classification of the dam are the loss of life, the property losses, the environmental losses, and the cultural built heritage, which there are none, I believe, in this reach of the river. So in here, I can give you some of so essentially the study area here is the very northern part, or the top part of the image is the Dalewood Reservoir, and this is, I believe, the 100-year flood that was simulated. And then in blue, and I will show another image here, so this is just around Parkins Avenue, so this is one of the flood damage centers. So what you see in blue is the 100-year flood line, 100-year flood line with the dam being in place. And then in red is that incremental extra flooding that happens as a result of the dam breaking. And then you see that there is a bit of extra flooding around the margins, and one nursery that used to be there at the time, and now it's just demolished, and there's some extra land that get grabbed as a result of this. But the depth of flooding is so low that it doesn't go meet the threshold for loss of life. So these kind of things are good to keep the dam at a very low classification. The same thing goes around Sunset Drive. Here is that level of incremental, so the red doesn't encompass homes. So for example, if the red was to capture homes and provide enough depth, that means that according to provincial rules, there would be potential for loss of life as a result of dam break. Luckily here, it didn't happen. So the ultimate finding of our study is that we have a hazard potential classification rating of low for Dalewood Dam, which then, according to provincial rules, means that the design flood is a 100-year event, which is the best possible thing that could have happened in our study, which I am very pleased. We have also found some other issues. The dam is presently operated with 2 stop logs on top of the concrete spillway, so I don't know if I will point to. Yes, I do. I can't point on the screen, of course, but okay. So Joe can say, okay, so there's the spillway, and then the 2 stop logs are placed on top of the spillway to increase the water level of the reservoir. So you can see that area below the bridge and above the spillway. So the area which the water can flow is now reduced because of the stop logs are placed in to increase the water level, and that decreases the capacity, and that makes the dam possible to overtop in something like a 10-year storm. So that is now a finding that the dam does not, in present operations of the dam, do not have enough freeboard capacity according to provincial rules, and having a 100-year-old structure, you don't want it to overtop in such frequent events, right? So that is one of the findings of this study, as well as the preliminary geotechnical investigations have identified some concerns with the berms. In addition, that they are not high enough, the crest elevation of the berms is not high enough to meet provincial standards, and some additional work would have to be done to bring that up to proper standards, and I think Elizabeth is working towards that with follow-up steps. The next, also part of the task here was to assess some of the public safety hazards. So if the people mix close to the dam and go to the structures, there's potential that they can be washed out in flood. So there were some areas in the proximity of the berms where we have noticed public doing some making little campfires and things in areas where flooding can happen very rapidly because the kettle is a very flashy catchment. Floods can come and go very quickly, so we are recommending putting signs and restricting general public from accessing the structures and being exposed to hazards. Now also, as part of these public safety assessment, the reservoir falls into scope here. So we're in a bit of a, so one of the things that we have identified here is this is the sidewalk at the new Dalewood Bridge. And what we see here is you see the railing with the red in the railing that stops, but there is a section of the sidewalk on both sides which is just a riprap bank with large stones with the reservoir downstream, and the sidewalk is right there. So there is a fall hazard here. So I mean, I have a 7-year-old kid who thinks he can ride a bike in an amazing way. He can't. If he ever falls into something like this, he will tumble over a 10-foot slope of rocks and eventually in the river. This is not safe. So this is one of the major things that now falls outside of the kettle's jurisdiction because they don't have the jurisdiction to do that. So my recommendation would be to work with the city of St. Thomas and to rectify this hazard and eliminate this potential hazard here. So that is one of the findings.
You're showing it, but how many meters is that from where the guardrail ends to where you'd like there to be some sort of structure?
So essentially that guardrail should be extended to, like in this image, towards me, and the same as on the other side. I don't remember exactly how much. It could be, I would say 30 to 40 feet, maybe more, maybe 50. I take measure and a walk would do it, but I don't have the number in front of me. But that's something that is there, the hazard is there, and the powers that be should sit together and try to rectify this situation, because the way it stands presently is a according to our safety assessment are concerned. So again, the next steps as a consequence of this, the Conservation Authority has to consider to change how the dam is operated because it doesn't have an adequate freeboard during flood conditions, and so the staff are aware of this fact. In order to bring up the dam to proper, up to its provincial standards, some additional investigations are recommended in our report, namely the geotechnical and structural, as well as there's a note about terrestrial and aquatic assessment, meaning that if the Conservation Authority is going to continue operating at the same water level as they are presently, the only reason they're doing that is because they believe that there is a value to the ecosystem upstream that is maintained in the reservoir. So I was just recommending, well, could you just pull the stop logs out and leave it and not have to buy a new stop log lifter? Possible if the terrestrial and aquatic assessment comes back and says that incremental is not there with the higher water level. So that's some other steps to be thinking about. And again, to be thinking about repairs for the dam or the new stop log lifter. So some decisions are to be made about that. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and welcome any questions or later.
Questions from Pat, Ralph, and Steve?
The log lifter, should there be one in place so that in the event of an anticipated flood, that a log could be taken out in order to let water go temporarily?
Yes, so that is how the dam, I guess it's supposed to operate presently. So ahead of the flood coming, the logs should be lifted, and then the flood should go, and then after the flood passes, the logs could be placed back. So that is the present status quo. But presently the logs are, I guess the stop log lifter and the logs are in need of repair and replacement, and that's something the Conservation Authority is looking at.
Mr. Chair, just if I can clarify, the log lifter itself is operational. Staff don't feel safe in operating it. The stop log lifter, the stop logs themselves, as well as the lifter, were already identified as slated for rejuvenation and new stop logs and new stop log lifter were already identified in that 2018 WATEC study. That was something that we should consider. So the issue with the stop logs, if I may, they haven't been moved probably 15 years, good 10 to 15 years, based on previous management decisions. And at this point, staff are pretty confident that we would be able to lift the logs, not very confident that the logs would go back in as easily as they would come out. They're showing signs that water is starting to move through them, so there's some initial rot and issues there.
Steve?
Thanks. A few questions, Mr. Chair. One is, what powers the log lifter? Like, is it electric? Is it diesel?
Mr. Chair, if I can ask Scott to answer that question.
Mr. Chair, to the member, it's a gasoline engine that actually operates it.
Yeah. Mini railroad.
A very old gasoline engine.
Secondly, in your report, you refer to what I affectionately call the old dam as the waterworks weir. In your scenarios of flooding, and that dam, which is built in 1904, is like about to be breached on the west side, or very close to it. I was down there yesterday to have a look. What, in your flood scenarios, if the new, and what I call the new dam, Dalewood Dam, if the new dam goes, does it blow up the old dam too, and does that doubly contribute to?
It wouldn't double it. That one, the waterworks weir is fairly small, much smaller in height than the new dam. that's 100 years old.
Yeah.
It wouldn't create additional, it drowns it out in a flood, so it wouldn't create additional, very much additional floodwaters because the amount that's impounded by that waterworks meter is very small. So that was considered in the study, and I deemed it to be too small to be, oh, shit.
Then my last question, Mr. Chair, is again dating myself, where I can remember the upper reservoir, and that by the time you got to Carr's Bridge, you had lots of open water on both sides of the causeway across Carr's Bridge, which is now all silted in. How much capacity, flood absorption capacity has been lost because of all that silting up above? Like, it's mind-boggling in my own time from the 1970s of remembering going out in a rubber raft from the Dalewood Dam to Carr's Bridge to what it is today. So, and I can remember north of that, almost up to County Road 52, it was all open water. So how much capacity has been lost because of all this silting?
So we didn't, that was not what we looked at in this study. We just looked at the current conditions as they are and break the dam at current conditions. What you're talking about would be an investigation of historic conditions and patterns, how they would have changed. We didn't look at that. That was not a question we were tasked with. And that question wasn't required to be answered to classify the dam according to provincial standards. So we were given a task, and we've executed steps to answer the questions we were given, of which your question was not part of. So I can't answer it. So I'm sure that there has been some adverse impact, but I don't have the numbers to back up the answer to you.
Bill?
And for you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if this is a Pat question or a Jennifer question, but when you mentioned the hazards are very low for this dam, is it as simple as this dam being classified as a flood control structure versus a recreational structure?
So the way the situation is presently at Dalewood Dam, it is not considered a flood control structure because there is no active storage in the dam. So that is another key, I guess, again, I explained that a bit. So when the floods come, the reservoir cannot hold the water back, and essentially whatever comes in will just flows out. So because the amount of sediment in and the way that the stop logs are lifted so high, the entire reservoir is full. So there is no storage in the reservoir. There would be ways to achieve that storage, but you would have to spend a lot of dollars removing the sediment, and that is just a nightmare, right? So the dam is not considered a flood control structure based on its current conditions and current characteristics today. Recreation, I guess any reservoir can be deemed recreation, but that's, provincial rules don't talk of the recreation versus flood control. They're usually both, but in this case, it's not flood control.
And the second part of that, again, and I know that might be in the next report, but does that work against us when we're applying for funding because the priority isn't flood control, is recreation, so it's at the bottom of the list for that pot of money that Jennifer refers to that's being applied for because it's not a high enough priority to receive,
Do you wanna, or should I?
Mr. Chair, to Bill, so the way the Recce program works, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but all structures get graded according to their classification and what their purpose is. There's a certain amount of money that's available, and then they look at each project and calculate it to whatever their standards are, and then if there's money to go towards it, then they go towards it. It depends on the type of project, if it's a study, if it's a repair, if it's a safety. Safeties are always accepted. Repairs, it just depends on what the project is and how many projects are submitted. So it could very well be that, it gets accepted. There's no harm in trying.
So in our submission, we need to get that word safety in there, lots, is that what we're saying?
Well, because the dam presently is not up to par to provincial standard. The crest elevation is too low, and present operations would mean that it could overtop in a much lower flow than it should be at. So there are concerns, and there is a 100-year-old structure that needs to be maintained. Now, just because that there would be no loss of life, or because if the structure fails, that doesn't mean the structure shouldn't be maintained.
Thank you.
Any further questions? If not, thank you very much, Pat, for the report. Much appreciated that we understand how our dam condition is in. And obviously, we have some challenges to overcome. Any further questions? Do I have a motion to accept the report? Preston and Ralph, all in favor? Carried. You wanna do that?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, the next report would be the WECI submission, and I'll just ask Pat to stay for this next report, just in case there's additional questions as we go through this next report. So obviously, Pat went through some key recommendations that came out of that report, and some key considerations that we have to take into account in terms of the operation and maintenance of the dam moving forward. As mentioned, there is a provincial funding program. It's called the Water and Erosion Control Infrastructure Program, and it does provide 50% cost shares for projects that are looking at maintaining dam structures in Conservation Authority ownership across the province. They're now accepting applications until February 21st, and we do require a motion of financial support from the board in coordination with that submission to the province. Pat's report basically outlined 3 additional studies that we probably should look at moving forward. Those were the geotechnical and slope stability study, so that's looking at those berms to see if we need to do any additional work on those, including increasing the height of the berms to withstand flooding moving forward. There's the terrestrial and aquatic assessment study, and so that's really looking at what operation of the dam will affect the terrestrial and aquatic study further upstream in the head ponds. And then the final one was the structural stability assessment, and that's looking really at the structural stability, overall stability of the structure itself. And then in addition to that, Pat did mention that there's a number of safety items that he identified, including fencing and signage. And those would all be projects that we could submit to WECI as well. If you recall, we put a kind of a placeholder in the 22 budget of $65,000, foreseeing that we would have to do some maintenance or further study on the dam. So that is in the budget as a placeholder. Based on staff's preliminary analysis of Pat's findings and what we have to consider, we're basically recommending to the board today that we undertake the geotechnical study. This will inform us as to the stability of those berms and what we have to do with them moving forward. So that's key in terms of looking at the structure itself withstanding or meeting ministry guidelines. So to me, that would be key. The second thing is looking at the log lifters and the stop logs. So currently, as it is, without those logs lifted, the dam would not withstand. The dam would overtop in a 10-year flood. And what the staff's concern is right now is that we have seen 10-year floods frequently in the last couple of years. So I think there was one in 2018, there was one in 2019. And then the most recent one was just very close to reaching the flows of a 10-year storm. So without those logs lifted, we're kind of flirting with the dam overtopping at any point at this time. And so to protect the structure itself, the staff would feel more comfortable with a log lifter that we feel safe operating, and with logs that we know can easily be lifted and put back down based on foreseen forecasts. as well as the various safety elements that Pat identified in the report as well. We'd like to get those addressed as soon as possible, again, just as good dam managers. So both of those projects is what Jen is prepared to put an application in for WICI. Again, WICI will offer 50% cost share, so it's the hope that those two combined projects, we would keep the overall impact to our budget at 65,000 or below. With the 50, hopefully that we were successful with the 50% cost share for the province, we would need a target well below that 65, but that is there. WICI is not guaranteed, so we'll put the application in. Safety does have a tendency to get better response from WICI, so we do want to separate them out into two applications with the hope that the stop log lifter, stop logs and safety might be approved. We might not be as successful with a geotechnical study. If WICI is not approved, then obviously we would come back to the board with a reevaluation of what we want to hit off in 2020 and what we can achieve within that $65,000 budget. So at this time, I'd be asking that the motion would be that staff prepare the applications for the WICI program for a geotechnical and slope stability assessment of the dam, and a second application for repair and safety measures around the Dale Dam, with the total budget impact for both projects not to exceed $65,000.
Questions?
So moved.
I had a question. So with regards to the lifter, I assume it's a mechanical winch on a gas, driven by a gas engine. Is that how it operates?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, it's, so it's a gas-powered engine with shafts running down. So the shafts control either the lifting device or the actual movement of the unit itself.
No safety features, though.
It requires 4 people to operate it safely because of the different levers that you have to use to engage some of the chokes. Yeah, we've actually used it, like we move it up and down the rail system to the different chutes, and we operate the up and down the portions that would actually lift the logs, but we've never actually connected to a log to try to move it.
All right, so we heard
Mr. Chair, I think Joe.
Through you, Mr. Chair, so what are we asking to do with the log lift? Replace the engine, replace the cables, or? I know we're gonna ask for some help with the funding of it, but are we replacing the whole works to make it modernized? Is that what we're looking at?
I'm not sure what WATEC recommended, but some of the ones that I've looked at are manual.
Right.
They're not motorized. They're just
a crane,
winch. Yes.
But a pulley system to make it so.
Correct.
Right.
Very safe, obviously, because no mechanical moving parts that you have to worry about. 2 people can operate it. Yeah.
So we may want to replace it with that, but we're not yet at
Yes.
what model we're buying if we
No.
want to do it.
No.
Okay, so the recommendation was that staff prepare applications for the water and erosion control infrastructure program for a geotechnical and slope stability assessment on the Dale Dam, and second application for repair and safety measures around Dale Dam with the total budget impact for both projects not to exceed $65,000. Ralph just moved that. Seconder Joe, for discussion. All in favor? Carried. And next, 2020 draft budget.
Mr. Chair, if Pat has somewhere to go, you.
Oh, no, I'm okay. I wanted to talk to Joe after, so if you don't mind.
Nope, that's great. Mr. Chair, so the draft 2020 budget, it was circulated to member municipalities on November 21st, 2019. And then a notice was sent out again on January 7th, just notifying them again of the upcoming annual general meeting and reminding them of the 3% increase in the draft budget in consideration. Both Central Elgin and City of London have recommended approval of the budget I do try to monitor your municipal agendas, so I apologize if there's been other motions on the books, but those are ones that I'm aware of. The actuals are now included in the draft budget that I sent out in these packages. There's been small adjustments made, basically to reflect the 2020 amortization rate and the 2019 actuals. So where I saw any item that may have been skewed by 2019 actuals in comparison with the other years, I may have upped or lowered certain items within that 2020 budget. But overall, those were minor adjustments and didn't impact the overall budget. Again, it's included in this package, and this is kind of your last look at the budget before it goes for consideration next week. I'm open and available for any questions or concerns with those small minor edits that we did. Otherwise, this would be the budget that's presented next week for your approval.
Questions, concerns? No, Southwold, we've had a budget that we've definitely approved your part of it, and we're waiting for a public meeting to finalize our budget. So this is a motion to receive and file. Move in second. Bill and Steve, all in favor? Carried. And next are multi-stakeholder consultations coming up on Friday.
Mr. Chair, so I think most of you are actually attending the session, so thank you for that. It was a great response from board members, and it's appreciated, because I know it's another day out of your schedules. The one coming up on Friday starts at 8:30. Registration is at 8:30. It's being held at the 4 Points Sheraton Bristol Ballroom on Wellington Street in London. Registration does start at 8:30. I'm told they're expecting upwards of 300 people at this session. There's been around 200 at the previous sessions held. So it would be a good idea to get there early to actually get a seat. Your names have been forwarded to MECP, so you should be able to check in with your name. In total, there's 3 sessions scheduled. The one occurred at Barrie on January 31st, another one last week in Colborne, and then the one scheduled this Friday. Invitations were sent out to conservation authorities, municipalities. There's certain stakeholders that have been invited by the minister to do presentations at the meeting. Conservation Ontario is one of those stakeholders. And included in your advanced packages, I did include the 10 questions that have been provided by Conservation Ontario. So Conservation Ontario has attended all 3 sessions, and these are a synopsis of the questions that will be asked at each table as they work through some discussions with those various stakeholders. So it kind of gives you an idea of what you're going into and allows you a chance to kind of prepare what you might have to contribute at those tables. I also took the liberty of just reminding you of some key points that we've raised throughout the summer and into the winter and fall. Again, Kettle Creek right now is not entertaining any programs and services that we didn't or weren't tasked with right from 1965 and 1967 when we had our conservation report. I think a really good point to raise with the province at this time is the Ontario Special Advisor on Flooding report to the government that was just released in 2019. Again, an independent report that was done that basically was very supportive of the CA model and noting that the development of modern floodplain policy in Ontario, the watershed approach, the conservation authority model, and the flood standards have been extremely effective at reducing flood risks. So that whole watershed concept was recognized by that special advisor as something that should be kept and duplicated across the province where CAs don't exist. Again, CAs were developed because of flooding, but KCCA's 1967 conservation report recognized the necessity to carry out those supplementary measures, such as methods of land use planning, tree planting, or stewardship efforts, all relate to the mitigation of flooding throughout the province. And that all of our programming really is dependent on our environmental monitoring and our ability to watershed-wide collect data and do tree planting and stewardship efforts. Just some of the stats that you'll see upcoming in our annual report. Again, we plant 50,000 trees annually. Wetlands has been a key focus of this authority. 4 wetlands created throughout the watershed this past year. Again, our revenue sources for 2020, we're trying very hard to keep that municipal levy at 35% or lower. And that's contingent on our ability to generate, self-generate revenue, especially with our campgrounds. And any programs and services that we brought online in the past couple of years, such as stewardship, are 100% self-generated, including our recently, our invasive species program recently is 100% self-generated and not relying on municipal levy to get those started. In terms of permitting, KCC issued 71 permits in 2019 and 100% were issued well within the timelines recommended by the province. And that's achieved through Joe doing very comprehensive pre-consultation processes. And again, just going back to that special advisor's report on flooding, his recommendations that again, what would help in terms of consistency across the CAs, across the province, would be that really the CAs are undertaking what the ministry has outlined in regulation and our technical guides, and what would increase consistency amongst the CAs is when MNRF updates those technical and implementation guidelines to support CAs in our delegated responsibilities for the province. So those were all included in the advanced package. Conservation Ontario also provide some preliminary concerns that they had heard that were identified by landowners, concerns on governance and things like those. Those were included in that package that I provided you.
Are those from the other 2?
Those were from, when I was doing the package, those were ones that are identified at the initial one in Peterborough on January 31st. I didn't update it with anything that was identified in Colborne. Didn't have time before the packages went out. But I think it gives you a general feel of what the feelings are on the landscape out there. And I did take the liberty of forwarding that out to your CAOs. So that they could share that. If they have knowledge of that, they could share that with any councillors planning on attending as well.
Questions for Elizabeth?
That's just a receive.
Motion to receive. Bill, secondary Val, all in favor? Carried. And last, February planning and regulations activity report.
Mr. Chair, Joe's out of the room, but I don't believe that there was anything unusual in that report. It's just to receive it.
Steve?
Question on permits. So if you're bringing dirt in from someplace else and dumping it up on tablelands that sort of adjoin the Cattle Creek Valley, you're supposed to have a permit for that?
If it was within the flood area.
Well, I'm talking on the top of a bank.
Uh-huh.
Like, is there a certain distance away where you can dump as much dirt as you want, or is there a point where you need to get a permit?
I think that probably the safest
Yeah.
question is to come speak to Joe and find out where the lines are. If there's a specific concern, I'd rather see it on a map and what you're asking about before I give a definitive answer.
Maybe I'll talk to Joe on the side.
My understanding, going through the building permit process is, you're required to stay so far away from a significant slope, depending on the grade of the slope. That's what it's based on, and when you encroach on that line, you have the ability to destabilize that slope and have it slide. Without speaking, that's through the building permit process, not pile of dirt, so we have to talk to anything. But I assume it has to be some sort of stability part of it.
Thanks.
Okay, motion to receive the report. There's no further questions. Steve? Dominique? All in favor? Carried. And lastly, closed session. We need a motion to go into close. Joe? Dominique? All in favor? Carried. Need a motion to adopt the minutes of the closed session meeting of January 23rd. Bill? Val? All in favor? Carried. And for item C of closed session, litigation, potential litigation, motion to order staff to proceed as directed.
So moved.
Steve and Dominique, all in favor? Carried. And upcoming meetings, next week is the AGM on the 19th at the St. Thomas Public Library, 9:30. Anything else to add?
No, Mr. Chair. I think you have a record though.
Record?
Yeah, not to tell me.
Yeah, and I'd brag about it if I was you.
I wish we could get out of county this early. Hey, motion to adjourn. Oh, sorry, I'll take it.
One quick question to Elizabeth. You indicated the 10 points for discussion this Friday were in the minutes that you sent out.
In the package, yeah.
I may have trouble finding them. Is there any chance
I
that you
can send you it as a separate document if you like.
would please do that?
That would help me too, then I don't have to drink cut
Sure.
and paste.
Exactly.
I'll do that for everyone. I'll
Thank you.
send what I need.
Good.
Thank you, Ralph, that made my job easier tonight.
Right, well, I thought I made a note here. I said, see, I
Motion to adjourn. Ralph and Dominique, all in favor? Here.